All right, hello. Welcome to the Meta Britain channel. First upload in a very long time, and this one's just going to be a fairly unserious, semi-fun, calling it a political time capsule stream with myself and Aaron Hook. Just going to be talking about basically what our sort of current politics are, where we've come from in that regards, and then hopefully in some years' time we'll either see fruition to some of the things we want, be proven right or wrong or whatever, or not. Mr. Hook, please do introduce yourself.
Hello, my name's Aaron Hook. I run a YouTube channel which is called Aaron James Hook, where I mostly review books, and I will be, in short order, be doing film commentaries. And also I do The Officer's Mess, where I review Sharp with Henry West and Meta. So I would recommend people go back and watch. We are on a break at the moment, but we will be coming back in March.
Yes, indeed, of course, highly recommend Aaron's channel, where I've been on especially, of course. All good fun. And yeah, lots of great stuff to catch up on there. So yeah, the purpose of the stream, the time capsule of our politics. Well, starting with myself, we'll both do our little spiels and then we'll go into sort of general discussion essentially. But yeah, myself, firstly, I suppose from a sort of metapolitical kind of standpoint is I'm a sort of a realist first, a pragmatist following. Um, I've not got any grand sort of meta narratives or anything necessarily that I ascribe to. I would hope that I can properly assess things as they are to a degree, and then sort of plot out where I think ought be best that we go. And that's kind of my approach to politics. But starting out, I think I sort of solidified myself as something of a traditionalist, and then sort of eventually a reactionary. Sort of essentially just seeing the political landscape, where the culture is going, and all the rest of it. Just seeing that it's not necessarily very good, and that aspects of the past were better, or should I say, not as bad as the progressivist, which I think is the dichotomy here, says it was. And I'd say that that is the proper solidified starting point. I'm not a sort of trad larper, as some would say. I don't think that everybody ought be just living in the sort of 1950s nuclear family, or even, prior sort of ways of living out in the woods or whatever. I'm a normal in that respect still, but I think tradition holds a high value. Something that has remained true for long enough and practiced for long enough by as many people ought to have some value to it, just instinctively. So from that point, I become then essentially a nationalist as well. And again, the dichotomy there for me is rather than globalist. I prefer that sort of on a personal, even aesthetic level. I think it's easier to do, and I would put it as sort of the most natural political ideology, if you could say that, because nations haven't always existed per se, not as we know them now in the last few centuries even, but certainly they seem to develop the most naturally of any sort of ordered, great society, linked to a state body. These, of course, are ethnic groups, people who share ancestry, culture, language, food, and all sorts of stuff, which have developed, slowly over a long time with each other, underwent ethnogenesis and stuff like that, and eventually they formed nation states. And that is, to a large degree, still what we have as our country's systems, from the national point of view, albeit, of course, say there's a massive globalist push, which I detest. Then also, I've therefore become a particularist, if that is a sort of political outlook, I'd say it is. And again, dichotomy is rather than universalist. I don't think all people are the same. You know, there's a whole liberal ideology which I react against greatly. That everybody necessarily sort of deserves equal rights, inalienably from birth or whatever. Just don't think that's actually the case. It's not true. It's a massive ought, and the is requirements for that ought to be brought about. They just can't actually be brought about, essentially. So everything must be on the particular. When I talk about nationalism, as previous, every nation is particular to itself. You can't be a international nationalist, for example. You can't be a Zionist for Israel and be a British nationalist, for example. Um, so yeah, all things particular, and that's again where ethnicity comes back into it. I think that politically actually shows up a lot more in people's thinking than you might necessarily think. As a normal sort of liberal, there is no such thing as the blank slate, the tabula rasa. And even with arguments of nature and nurture, I think ethnicity still overrides that. It sort of encapsulates a large aspect of both. Um, there's something called the pre-political there, where you get a sort of social formation of groups, and it sort of kind of just makes people have certain presuppositions and loyalties, tribal loyalties, which you wouldn't necessarily think about actively, but they're certainly there. And again, with a particular rather than universal, um, you may think that everybody in the world can just be given, say, sort of like a libertarian state. Things will just run themselves. That is not true. You may have been able to do that with, American settlers in the 1850s, on the west coast of America, building their own things up still. But it's not, the case with, you couldn't just chuck one group of people into another. These things exist. The pre-political, the ethnic is the base of all politics for me. And so that makes me sort of liberalism last. I think there is some element, particularly within the Anglo, which calls for it, some amount of liberalism. Don't tell me what to do and so on. I can do it myself. But yeah, well, I'll get onto that bit more in a bit. But I think essentially a liberalism last politics is the way to go. Basically, it's a necessity now, where it might have been not so some centuries ago, but essentially you just can't dictate every aspect of culture, people's lives, the economy, and all that stuff. You can't centrally plan everything. You might think you can, you might think it'd be that simple, but it's just not the case. Um, as a liberal point of view, being quite individualist, you surely would recognize that actually every individual is quite different, even if there are many shared collective, say, ethnic, polity things, the pre-political remains. You just can't tell everybody what to do in all ways and all times, all cases. So, that, and you kind of want a people at some point able to self-govern. It just makes things easier, more efficient, and so on. So liberalism last as well as another point of my politics. And economically as well, economic nationalism, that's what I'm for, mixed economy as well. That requires a bit of protectionism in the age of mass and scale and globalization, and where humans are treated as capital, or the human capital of borders which are porous, with not only capital flow but also labor flow as well. Kind of all of the economic theories predating globalization are kind of out the window, and that's why I'm also open to quite wild new ideas, like taking back the idea of guilds in a way, as a sort of protectionist, economic nationalist idea, as replacing essentially the union system, which exists obviously only for begging for more money from taxpayers, for the most part at least. So the final thing as well for me is systems of governance, because we're not really necessarily touched on that yet. But there's the big question mark of democracy and the liberal democracy we live under. Well, it wasn't always a liberal democracy, to be fair. There was a time pre 1911 Parliament Act in Britain where you had a limited franchise constitutional monarchy. And I think that would be the kind of ideal to return to, actually. You're not necessarily going on a slippery slope with that being the case. For the right people, that can absolutely work. But of course, we are a somewhat different people now, with a load of very different people around us. And so until we had a homogenous Anglo nation again, I don't think that's even possible, nor what you would want with this being the case, the demographics and so on, and the world being how it is. I'm almost now calling for sort of a one-party state, effectively. I think you look at China, for example, and to a degree Russia, and they have shown an immense amount of sort of, nationalistic ability. in what they are. They've been able to keep a lot of their own culture intact to a large degree. Still massively under globalization. It's hit all of us, but at least they've stayed mostly out of the grasp of the what we call global American empire, the soft power empire that they have. The culture has been pushed on them. China, particularly there, certainly. And I have a feeling that essentially the civilization that is going to win this century and last out the least sort of badly damaged is likely to be whoever has the strongest sort of state, essentially, one party state particularly, and that is looking to be China right now. So it seems to me those people who have a healthy balance of things, in the aspects that I would balance, at least, are doing quite well for themselves, actually. So I say that in general is all my politics wrapped up. But before we go into any of that, Arron, over to you. Good sir.
Oh yeah. I'd say in terms of my politics, I'm not that much. I'm not that much different from yourself. I'm very much a reactionary and a nationalist. I've always been a nationalist and sort of reactionary. I mean, becoming a reactionary was sort of something that I came to by the time I was in my late teens, early 20s. It was just made sense. Again, I'd like you. I'm not somebody who thinks we should go back and live, say, in the trees and forests and things like that. But I do think there were certainly things better in the past, and there were certainly attitudes that were better in the past. So, particularly the Victorians, who had this attitude of regarding material progress and tradition as not two things that are going head to head, but two things that march together side by side, and that's something that we've lost today. That either you have to have material progress or you can have tradition, whereas the truth is you can have both, and it's not. It's actually not difficult to do both at the same time. And I'm again very much an economic nationalist. I'm very much a protectionist. But I'm also I think I'm more interventionist than most people would be. For example, I would have no problem whatsoever if we renationalised the railways and had them state run, because they are just they're the natural monopoly, and running them that way would be, to my mind, better than the current system. And for all of its issues, British Rail did work actually quite a lot of the time. So the stuff I'd want to return to would be stuff that from the past did work and that could work again. Parliament would be another example of that. I am firmly in favour of a House of Lords that's not only unelected, but is wholly hereditary and that has its veto. I very much want to go back to that period, as you mentioned, better in terms of Parliament, of essentially pre-1911, and I don't think I think there would be issues with doing that, but there would be issues that could be overcome. Everything that sort of you've mentioned that I'm mentioning here is entirely workable and that can be done. It's just sort of the effort to put it in power, put it in place, and then to wield it. But yeah, I think one of the big things with my politics that sort of shaped it was sort of interest in Northern Ireland. Unlike most British people, I don't have any Irish ancestry. So when I look across the Irish Sea, I see the Irish Catholics as foreign, and I see the Ulstermen as British. And so my sort of that sense of ethnic nationalism, the innate ethnic nature of nationalism and the nation state was always clear to me. That conflict there was an ethnic one between the British and the Irish, and so my understanding of British nationalism has always been ethnic, and so the nation and also England in particular is one of the oldest nation states in the world. One of the reasons why the Normans were so successful when they took over was because the Anglo-Saxons had built up essentially a fully working centralised nation state, and so they just were able to kill or cut off the top 10% and take over. And so yes, the nation state is the ultimate political expression of a people. It is also the ultimate political reality. An empire is really just the extension of a nation, at one remove. It is not. It's not anything bigger than a nation, if that makes sense. And attempts at sort of creating things bigger than a nation, so like the EU, are always going to fail because you're expecting people with particular interests to sort of subsume those interests into sort of more sort of broad utopian ideals, and it's never going to work. And it should never work either. It's just unnatural. And so, yeah, that sense of the particular is something I do share as well. That came from reading Edmund Burke, and also Jeremy Bentham with their criticism of the French Revolution. One of my favourite political insults is Jeremy Bentham's one, where he was describing the French concept. Well, essentially describing natural rights, but in the French Revolutionary concept, and he described them as nonsense upon stilts. That's perfect. It's true. That's as true for human rights today as it was for natural rights in the 1790s. And so, yeah, so pretty much that's my politics altogether.
Oh, excellent stuff. And it seems, of course, yes, as we know, we're quite similar on these things.
Yeah.
And so there's not, a great deal to sort of synthesize, but there's still very interesting points there between us both. So there's no need to go back over what I said. Yeah, just jump straight into a sort of synthesis. So historical points of view, I think, are obviously absolutely necessary now. I think part of, as I started off by saying, seeing the world as it is just a complete necessity for realist-based politics to a degree. For what works, the pragmatic and all that stuff is required. A knowledge of the real political landscape, and obviously, well, we have the amazing thing called hindsight and history books and Google and so on, where we can see the mistakes of the past, the successes of the past, what did and didn't work, and so on. And in a way, the new traditionalism is just taking the bits that worked from the past, which may very well continue through till today, or which we could benefit from continuing today, and running with them, or making them work. And so I agree greatly, of course, on the historical aspects of things. I even gave a non abstract sort of quite specific date prior to law, we both agree on as well, of course, is that it's the pre-1911 Parliament Act, where, of course, we get the hereditary aspects of the Lords, essentially our political aristocracy, having been pretty well neutered. And, well, I mean, you could probably better describe why that happened and what it meant.
Yeah, it was a combination of things. The Liberals had won a landslide in 1906, and they were bringing in social reforms, which were broadly necessary, but they wanted to do it through. They were doing it through high taxation, and they essentially put through what was called the People's Budget under Lloyd George, and the Lords rejected it. They were probably unwise in doing so, but they did reject it, and so the Liberal government under Asquith decided they were going to pass a Parliament Act to give the House of Commons the right to override the House of Lords, thereby changing the constitutional settlement that existed since 1689. And the way they got this passed was by threatening to essentially overwhelm the Lords with new peers. And so there was a big battle. This ended in 1911 with the passage of the 1911 Parliament Act. There were two general elections in 1910 over it, in which the Liberals actually lost both elections, but they were able to stay in power through agreements with the Irish Home Rule Party, the Irish Parliamentary Party, and the Labour Party, which was then on the rise. And so it was passed along with the subsequent Irish Home Rule Act of 1914, sort of gotten through sort of squalid parliamentary sort of dealing purely to keep the Liberals in power. It was it was not as is generally portrayed by Liberals and left wingers as this glorious advance for democracy. It was the Asquith and the Liberal Party trying to remain in power because the Tories were close to winning. It was just
Yeah, indeed. And the old Tory party, the rotten, zombified creature that it is, propped up by whatever the other might be. All of that came out of this essentially political settlement, should we call it? If we're talking about how currently essentially the Western wide system is liberal democracy, and everything that actually means in practice. Well, that essentially is where it happened. Um, of course, all of this changed eventually over decades since. Particularly just after World War One and the interwar period, and likewise just after World War Two, you get the switch into a different type of geopolitics altogether, which essentially cements all of those prior things, all of the prior liberalisms and the left socialisms and so on, into being essentially the norm. And yeah, we can thank those involved for that, of course. So yes, although of course we want to say pre 1911. Yeah, we probably might even say pre 1911, with several of the cancers excised as well. So as not to sort of slippery slope our way back to the current day. Push things back a century, but we would prefer, of course, a 1,000-year constitutional monarchy, wouldn't we? So, yes, that's another aspect, I think, of course, where we have an appreciation. Of course, so we'll find no disagreement between ourselves, but we know between ourselves and the mass of people, the sort of political norm of the day, having things like the House of Lords be very powerful, be hereditary, to a degree, just straight up nepotistic, a true aristocracy, if only by, sort of political set rather than necessarily huge long lineages. Because as we know, in the House of Lords, people may only sit in there for a few generations and be swapped out. The circulation of elites happens regardless of these hereditary systems. But how, as an interesting question, would you think if we did sort of reinstate somehow, if it somehow happened, a new aristocracy was raised, or a new House of Lords was sort of brought about, refreshed, reinvigorated, reformed even? Who do you think that would be? What sort of class of people do you think that aristocracy would likely rise from?
I think it would rise from the people who did it. So it would very much be, in many ways, a repeat of 1689, where, for those who don't know, when the Glorious Revolution happened, a significant portion of the British aristocracy, but also say the aristocracy in England, Wales, Scotland, North, and Ireland, went abroad to support James II, and those who remained essentially re-established this sort of political aristocracy, and then they brought people in. And so I think what would happen is that you would see a sort of refresh. The way to do it would be to gradually restore the House of Lords. So first you repeal the Blair reforms, which wouldn't be too much, because they're less than they're just over 30 years old, and most of them are comparatively minor compared to what happened before. It was 97. So most importantly, restoring the hereditary peers, and then you pass an act which gets rid of life peerages and means only hereditary peerages can be given. And then what you do, that would cause a reaction of quite a lot of the liberal and left wing people refusing on principle to accept hereditary peerages. And so then you start putting in our people, as it were. And then you sort of gradually do that, and over the course of a couple of decades, because I think if we're in the situation we're talking about, it would be a complete sea change of politics. It would be at least a generation or two before the other side were even capable of getting back into power. And that would be enough time to sort of turn things around and set the course so that when they did come back in, they would have to accept the new order, as it were. And so from that, you will get the gradual build-up of the new political aristocracy. So it would be from our people, sort of Yeah, combined with elements of the old order that would accept new order and integrated into it.
Yes, certainly. I think the House of Lords is often overlooked with our politics. People seem to forget. They think it's all just, sort of American style. We've got this sort of pseudo presidential figure, be it someone, contemporary politics now is looking like to be, oh, I want Farage in, or I want Lowe in now. Um, the person who is ruling the country is Keir Starmer. Well, they may be the prime minister, but they're still just a minister among 649-ish other members of Parliament in the House of Commons. And while it is indeed the House of Commons, since the settlement of 1911 on, more and more so, it's just become the complete normal governor of the system. But the House of Lords is still there, even as they were when Walter Bagehot wrote the English Constitution, 1850s or 60s, I think it was.
Yeah,
The the House of Lords was even back then seen as primarily a blocking force. A dignified element of that, a bit of a theatrical element of that to a degree, but nonetheless, the guys who dot the I's and cross the T's don't let anything necessarily stupid pass, and they do indeed sort of just slow things down a little bit. They're the sensible part of the system, or they should be. Generally older people who, because of the hereditary aspect, were highly tied in to the living constitution as it was, which has been totally, completely torn up now, of course. But if you are to have a sort of oligarchical class of people being the final deciders as to how our laws are passed, which is obviously Parliament's primary job, you'd probably rather have it be people who are generationally tied in to the governance of the country rather than it be just, say, business people or, well, just, generally foreign people or what have you. Of course, these people are always going to bring up new people, and as I say, entirely requires a new set of people to come in. And then once it does, and the hereditary aspect is re-solidified, fantastic. A bit of the conservative given allows our guys in, as the others hopefully indeed resign or just don't bother on principle. um, and that is what actually solidifies the wins. As, of course, everyone's always rightly saying, well, you may be able to get, say, a political party to a majority or become the loyal opposition. But what actually happens then if you lose that position in 4 or 5 years' time, next general election? Well, yes, absolutely right, and that's why I think people need to quite seriously actually target the creation of not just a set of members of parliament, as it is, in our current political system, but the House of Lords, and even outside of that, you know, an aristocracy of sorts, hereditary if possible. We need to have our own people building parallel to the system as it is, so that if the time comes, we can just step into it fully formed to a large degree. Um, you know, it has indeed been done before, per Glorious Revolution, essentially, which was, of course, a whole event that had been contrived by very few people indeed. Was it the Immortal Seven, six of whom I believe were,
yes,
was it Lords or MPs?
yes. Most of them were in the House of Lords. Yeah. One of the big differences between, say, the current political order and the old order was the fact that the aristocracy had their power bases outside, or were not reliant on Westminster for their power, and that meant that that meant that it was difficult to remove them once and for all completely, which is why some of them are still there, and
Mhm.
so that sort of shows the resilience of the system and why restoring it, even though it would probably it'll be a gradual thing, but restoring it is the best way to ensure things return to things get back on their feet, as it were.
Yes, quite. I think really the necessity of just clearing them out essentially has been the mission statement of the quote unquote online right, dissident right, whatever name you want to call it. All of us, to some degree. We just want these lot gone, please. And just about anybody who isn't them could probably do things better. And if that is what comes about, essentially, as the time capsule element of the stream, that is the best that we could possibly hope for. The two-party system to break down, which it looks like it is doing. The whole rotten system, the liberal democracy element, all of it to hopefully fade away, and a return, if we get what we want, is just that, a return to things as they were to a degree, and not to slip back into what we are now, with all the dirt having been thrown on it since. So one more little thing there as well, which I found interesting from you, was the nationalist process, as I call it. Essentially, that there are nation states and there are empires, and likelihood is you're still going to be, as a nation state, trapped within some sort of empire. And I would bring about the American empire, as it is a soft power empire now. It's not truly official, it's not called an empire, but it kind of is, certainly in this frame it is. America, as a nation state even, is trapped within the empire of America. You could even say the same sort of with the British Empire, although that was obviously a lot more to its own benefit, I think, because of different times altogether. But there is a sort of pendulum which swings, I think, between having a truly for its own self independent nation state and being essentially the head of an empire, and otherwise being stuck within somebody else's completely. I should say, the pendulum swings from independence in the middle, being within an empire to the left, or being the empire to the right. It sort of swings around and around for any sort of one state. And whilst we had one ourselves, of course, an empire, we have swung toward the independent, and then swiftly found ourselves stuck within that sort of soft American empire. That is, to me, how I see things going. Obviously, falls in between the nationalist stuff that we spoke about as well, of course. But where does that pendulum then swing back to? It seems to me back towards the independent nation state. The direction that would be for the American empire is back towards them just being a nation state again, simply, or at least withdrawing their empire, and for us to withdraw from their empire, from their control somewhat, and be more independent again. I actually see that happening. That's not me giving a I want this to be the case. I literally think that is going to happen to some degree. We've shown that we can leave the EU, for example, and be relatively all right for the most part. But what say you on that? The nationalist process, I call it, the pendulum swing. What do you see happening?
Yeah, I agree. I do think we are in the process of well, we're actually sort of reverting to type. That in the 50s, before Suez, well, even sort of between sort of Suez and the Wilson government coming to power in '64, there was this attempt to build a sort of middle, sort of an independent course where Britain would still have some sort of imperial settlement over elements of the Middle East and the ocean, but otherwise become independent, sort of follow what the French essentially did with West Africa, with Western Central Africa with Francofrique. And that, I think that's what we're going to see, where Britain will return to, as you say, a sort of independent sort of course, and using sort of the sort of dotted remains of empire, so the Falkland Islands, Cayman Islands in the Caribbean, Gibraltar, the naval bases, the sovereign bases on Cyprus, will be able to act independently. And I think the way we will become independent from the Americans will be because we can act as a sort of we can sort of act as a more we can act more independently as an ally, and that the more we're able to act independently as an ally will lead to the Americans sort of backing up, as it were, doing a hands-off approach, and eventually we'll get to the stage where we're independent of them. I do think the Americans have got a bit more of a problem which is there is this narrative that Americans have, particularly those who are so critical of the American Empire, who say that America was a republic from sometimes from sort of 1776 until sometimes they say 1860 and the Civil War, or 1898 and the Spanish American War, or even 1917 entry into World War One, and then America became an empire. No, America was always either a Republican empire or an imperial republic from 1776 onwards. They are constantly going for imperial expansion from beginning to end. In fact, one of the big motives for independence was wanting to go west, wanting to colonize west. And so I think the Americans are never going to truly be able to become a nation state. They're always going to be an empire because they always were. But their empire will get will sort of shrink back to the Americas and possibly areas of the Pacific. So they won't be the global sort of all omnipresent sort of empire that they are at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point as well, that from the very beginning they always had imperialist ambitions. That is completely true. And the pendulum swing for them has always been a greater and greater momentum towards becoming the global American empire, which particularly World War II allowed them to achieve. But they've sort of burned out so quickly with that energy. It seems now indeed they are drawing back in. And again, with the time capsule element of this, it'll be interesting to see in a year, 2, 3, 4, 5 years' time how quickly this accelerates. But taking down, stripping back the empire for the benefit of oneself, one's nation, is requiring some amount of pulling inwards, withdrawing, retracting, and that is happening. America is pulling currently out of Europe to a degree. Not necessarily financially, a little bit, but mainly militarily, and shifting focus towards indeed the Pacific, which makes most sense. Just look on a map. They're failing to do so, of course, in the Arctic Circle so far, but we'll see how it goes. And likewise, Britain is also pulling its people out of the Pacific. The Navy is essentially pulled out of there altogether. And, our job is to instead point our ships, what few we have, towards Russia. And so, looking at that, it seems that these are making sense, right? We are all each looking a bit more sort of inwardly. And the particular aspect of the nationhood of the United Kingdom and United States, plural, and I suppose in a way you could nowadays call it the United Kingdoms to a degree, albeit, none of them are necessarily kingdoms because there's only one king. Anyway, that nature of essentially, firstly, England being the nation state, and you said earlier that, the nation really is the English first. That is literally an Anglo-Saxon word, or Anglo-Norman, whatever. It's an Anglo word, is nation. Although, derived, I think, from whatever. You can look at the etymology of that on Google or something. But that's our word, that's our thing, that's our way of doing things. But then, in centuries since, particularly 1707 Union Act on, Britain came about as the union between England, Principality of Wales, and Scotland, and then, of course, Ireland, Northern Ireland, and so on. And in a way, Britain, or the United Kingdom, is the English Empire. And likewise with the United States, well, each of the states are essentially, they're federally ran by the president, elected nationally, sitting in Washington, D.C., in the White House. And all the states and all of the foreign elements of that, which I would include Alaska, Hawaii, is it Puerto Rico? Yeah, that's the one. And so on. Of course, there was the Philippines as well, can't forget that. And then all of the sort of soft places they culturally control as well. Every place where there is a McDonald's, they act similarly. They have their home empire and then the empire abroad. And the empire abroad is what has got to go, essentially, for all of us to a degree. Decolonization was forced upon us. I think if you as much as possible, do that willingly yourself, essentially, you can manage it much better, as we were doing up until Suez, where we did it a little bit too well. Um, and yeah, someone else came along, America, and kicked us in the teeth for it. I would not wait for the kick in the teeth from a multipolar world. If I were
Yeah.
America, I would try and get that done now. And I implore any true Americans, American nationalists, American firsters, essentially, to take that stance. What being a nationalist means currently in America is kind of the opposite to what it means to be a nationalist right now in Britain. We need to reclaim actually some independence and even a little bit of imperial ambition, just a teeny weeny pinch. America basically needs to do the same via destruction of its own empire, which seems a difficult thing to get past people's minds. But, what say you?
It is difficult, and I think it's going to be extremely painful for the Americans because, as you say, as we mentioned before, their momentum is always is expanding and going outwards and getting bigger. And I think we were for the most part able to deal with the end of empire because we had the nation state to fall back on. It pre-existed the empire, whereas the Americans' identity is ever perfect, things getting ever better, ever perfect, ever perfecting union, and it's the withdrawal from their sort of global empire back to their continental empire is going to be a psychologically painful process for them, but a necessary one. I don't know how well they're going to necessarily handle it.
Yes, indeed. The people I've spoke to on this so far, it's been really difficult to try and put that forward. People seem to think that there is essentially the civilization state near to come about. Well, essentially what that would mean is an EU-like or sort of Western-like structure, essentially, yeah, centrally governed from somewhere. It's going to have to be somebody. And you and I both being more particularist on that rather than universalist, not globalist and all the rest of it. We don't like that. We don't like the
Yeah.
idea of the EU. We don't like the idea of pan-Europeanism either. We don't react against America by saying, oh, we've got to create a stronger European Union. No, we say we have to have a stronger nation state, and all the other nation states of Europe ought to be the same way. We don't want to be a grey sludge, in the racial aspect, nor in the, central state, civilization state aspect either. That is the other way of doing things, basically. It seems to me that track is what you want to be fighting against. If you're any way inclined towards our way of thinking about things or our politics here, because otherwise you'll just continue things somewhat as they are in a decline. Because I think the limit has been reached for American expansion quite clearly. There is no great enemy for the American empire, and as such, the whole mimetic cycle of good men create hard times, whatever it is, that one. Easy times create bad men, etc., etc. We're in the easy times, surrounded by bad men, and those capable among us with the right ideas. Certainly, I think need to be doing what they can to push us in what we think, of course, is the right direction. And yeah, part of that mission, I think, is meta political, as I've been looking into recently. Hence, also the name as well, Meta Britain. I like the idea. I like to approach things from a meta perspective as possible, a little bit outside the box, and all the rest of it. But yeah, that seems to cover basically everything so far. So yeah, went on even longer than I thought we would, which is fantastic. So, any wrapping up, any shilling you might want to do, sir?
The Officers' Mess will be returning in March, so if this is up in March, we'll be on, shall we say. That's the ongoing thing on my channel.
Yes, indeed. Yes, I think it's probably be going out mid February as a recording. So, yeah. As for returning in March, the Officers' Mess stream continues on Mr. Hook's channel. Indeed.
Yep.
So obviously go check that out as well, and then also stand by hopefully for another one or maybe two of these political time capsule streams as well. And yes, all the best. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.